Hi, Mitchell Levy, global credibility expert, and I am so glad you get to enjoy what I am about to enjoy. I'm with Davin Salvagno, who I have known for a while, and just this guy shows up. Well, you know what? Let me let you hear directly from Davin. Davin, hi and welcome.
Mitchell, great to be here. Thank you so much. Looking forward to our conversation today.
Yeah, me too. All right, so who are you?
Who am I? It's such a broad question. Well, let's see. In order, I am a Christian. I am a husband to my wife, Amy, of soon to be 18 years. I am a father to our two kids, Vera and Bennett, who are 14 and 11, and our golden retriever, Brinkley. I am a author, speaker, business leader, entrepreneur, executive coach, proud member of the MG 100 like you, Mitchell. And I am passionate about people and helping them fulfill their purpose personally and professionally.
I am so glad you did not disappoint, right? I I will from here on in when somebody says, "How should I answer that question?" Once we are live in a couple of platforms, but when I post this also on the podcast channel, I will point them to this podcast because it's not just about you in terms of what you do for work and how you make money, but the bigger, broader you. So so Darren, how do you balance it all? That's a lot of stakeholders you have in your life.
That is a lot of stakeholders. And you know what? That's you could also you could offer that those are actually competing purposes. I share that a lot. We think of purpose as this grandiose idea for our lives, which could make purpose seem so big and unmanageable. How do you balance it all? But when you break it down and realize that purpose is plural and momentary, as I mentioned, I have a purpose as a husband, as a father, as a speaker, as an author, as a writer, as a musician. We didn't even go there. Um, I have to ask myself, well, what's important now? So when there are competing purposes and competing priorities, I just ask myself, what is the most important hat that I would need to wear right now? I mean, Mitchell, I love your hat. You're always wearing a hat. And so I got all these different hats that I have to put on. So depending on what the most urgent need is, depends on what the most important purpose I step into is.
That's interesting. So you use the word purpose. Why don't we give me your definition of what purpose means?
Purpose is our reason for being. It's who we are. You asked who I am, and I shared a whole variety of different elements of who I am. I think there's been a lot of confusion between purpose and why. Those words get used interchangeably, and I would offer that purpose is your reason for being, your why is your reason for doing. Purpose is what you exist to do, your why is your motivation for doing it. You could be very clear about what your purpose is, but there could be days where you're just not motivated to step into it. And so we can get into a different discussion maybe later, diving into those. But in essence, purpose is who you are. It is your unique set of gifts, talents, abilities, skill sets. It's everything that you have in here and in here to make an impact in the lives of those around you. My dear friend Kent Chevalier puts it this way: purpose will always involve you, but it will never be about you. So purpose, in essence, is your impact on others.
So clearly, there's two things that pop in my mind on that, right? So one is purpose from your perspective is what I call legacy. It's what people say about you when you're not in the room. And purpose is about servant leadership.
Absolutely. And when you talk about legacy, right? You think about that. If we were to ask, who was Steve Jobs? Everyone would say, "Oh, well, Steve was the CEO and co-founder of Apple." That wasn't his purpose, but that was certainly his legacy. It was one of his purposes, but he had multiple purposes as well. And so I think that's very interesting that you say that, Mitchell, because I think when we think about legacy, if people were to ask, what was Davin's legacy? I would want them to say exactly how I just introduced myself. He was first and foremost a Christian, a devoted husband, a devoted father, an author, a speaker, a coach, right? So to your point, yes, hopefully there is alignment between our purpose and our legacy.
You know, what I love about this is obviously, since you run something called the Purpose Summit, I would assume you would have your purpose, right? And you do. Um, I have found, and maybe this number is wrong, so I'd love to hear it, that 90% in my research, 90% of humans have never actually run into and understand their purpose. And that means they are born, live, and die without ever knowing that. Is that number close to accurate, or what do you think?
I think it's probably very accurate. I haven't done the research on what the percentage is that people don't know or haven't clearly defined their purpose. But I do know that when I start talking about purpose, I can count on one hand how many times people have been able to say, oh, well, my purpose is, and be able to state it. So the fact that people haven't just regularly offered it would probably allude to the fact that your statistic is probably true, that more than 90% of people have never truly defined what that is for themselves.
Wow. Okay. So, good question. The big question I often ask is why. I mean, you know, for me personally, I spend energy on allowing people to articulate where they're executing on their purpose in less than 10 words. And I got that from going to the Purpose Summit. But I don't spend time helping people sort of articulate their purpose or find their purpose. But why do you think that is? I mean, why is it that people don't sort of stumble? Like when you said it, it was spectacular. I want that to be one of the clips that we share. But tell me why people don't do that.
I think it goes back to what I shared earlier, is that purpose in and of itself is a big question. I mean, people have been asking what's the meaning of life for thousands of years, and it's a big question to answer. And so when we make purpose so big and so grandiose, and especially if we make it singular, if we say that you can only have one definitive purpose, what is that? Well, how do you choose? I just shared that I have multiple purposes. So I think the reason that few people have been able to define it for themselves is because they've always thought of purpose as singular and grandiose. And that is just way too big of a question to try and, define so narrowly. But when you step back and you realize that purpose actually can be plural and can be momentary, that you can have multiple purposes in each and every moment, depending on who is around you and what your role is that you play in making an impact in their lives, then it becomes much more easier to tackle and much more easier to define. I would offer that if you think about what I shared earlier, that who is in the room or who you're talking about gives clarity to what your purpose is, depending on who it is you're talking about.
Yeah, you and I are so aligned with what I do on the clarity side. So I'm this is juicy, and thank you. Part of what you do and how you show up is having the intent and commitment to do the right things by others. It's just what I see with you. Explain what that means to you. How do you go about executing on that?
Well, I don't know if I execute on it 100%. I don't think any of us do. I hope my batting average is pretty good. I didn't play traditional baseball, but I hope at least when it comes to at-bats and doing right by others, that it's a high percentage. One of the things that I've shared is that, we often judge others by their actions, but we want to be judged by our intentions. And I don't know anyone who wakes up and says, I want to do wrong by others. I think most people are well-intentioned and want to do right by others. Unfortunately, our actions don't always line up with our intentions. And when that happens, we are perceived as not doing right by others. And yes, are there some manipulative, maniacal people out there? Of course there are. Not everyone is, an angel or a saint. But I do believe that by and large, that the large portion of humanity wants to do right by others. They are well intentioned. I think the challenge is that we often don't slow down enough to make sure we understand what people's intentions are or were before we judge them by their actions. And sometimes people get mislabeled as not doing right by others when they intended to do right by others.
Okay, well articulated. The interesting part, and you created something called the Purpose Summit, and maybe you should talk about why you created that. Like, what was the purpose of the Purpose Summit, and what have you seen happen to it over time? Because you've run it for a number of years. So,
well, I co-founded the Purpose Summit with my friend Kurt David, and the Purpose Summit began in 2019. And the reason it began is I had just written my first book, Finding Purpose at Work, and Kurt had just finished writing his book on change and from glory days, and he was running around and speaking on individual purpose, particularly athletes. He was helping athletes who they'd spent their entire life playing a sport, and that sport had become their identity, and now they're no longer playing that sport, and they were trying to answer the question, well, what's my purpose now? If football or basketball is not my purpose, what's my purpose now? And he was helping a lot of struggling athletes. I was running around with organizations helping them find purpose at work. I was helping them re-clarify their founding purpose as an organization. Why did you go into business? What was the origin story of the impact and the difference that you wanted to make before it became about growing the bottom line? And how are you helping people find purpose at work and connect their purpose to what it is they do and to your organization's purpose? So we had met, and we had this conversation and said, what would it look like if we had a 2-day timeout? I just shared that few people find purpose, or few organizations focus on purpose because they don't slow down enough to clarify what it is and how to step into it. So we wanted to create almost a 2-day pause. Day 1 on individual purpose, day 2 on organizational purpose, and bring in different authors, thought leaders, speakers who were talking about purpose, Mitchell, the way that you and I are right now. I had met some amazing different authors, thought leaders, and speakers on the topics of individual organizational purpose. And we had met some really great organizations that were exemplifying well what it looked like to connect individual and organizational purpose. And we thought, well, what would it look like to bring everyone together in the same room to hear from each other, to sharpen each other, to share ideas? And so it was like we were all singing the same song, but playing different instruments. So it became this symphony of purpose, if you will. And it started as an idea in 2019. It grew from there over the last 6 years, 2 years in Detroit, 2 years at the University of Notre Dame. And now we'll be celebrating 2 years in Charlotte. I know you came last year. I'm looking forward for us being there again. But that was the essence of why we began it and why we continue to move forward.
Have you been both positively and negatively surprised by either attendees or presenters? And
Wow.
and I guess I'd love to hear a positive surprise. If you feel the need to do a negative surprise, you could do that too.
I have immensely been surprised positively by both attendees and speakers. In fact, one of the things I'm excited about that we have planned for this year when we open is we're going to be doing an opening segment with 4 specific people who have attended or spoken at previous summits, whose lives or careers have dramatically been changed or altered as a result of something they heard someone say, or someone they met, or something that happened, following our time together at the Purpose Summit. I never cease to be surprised. It's really hard to give you one example because it's very, very different. You and I, we have opportunities to speak in lots of places, and one of the things that's really unique about the summit, and this is probably the biggest surprise. So I'm going to share a surprise that exemplifies multiple speakers, not just one, is that, when you and I are typically asked to speak at a conference, we come in, we speak, and, maybe we're there for a day. I personally like to stay for the entire conference, meet people, and not parachute in and do a canned talk and then parachute out. In fact, Lisa Oprita, who has served, kind of as my right hand really for the last 6 years, has always said, how are none of your 2 talks ever the same? And the reason why is because they're always adapted to the environment that I'm in for what I'm observing in the room. And the reason I share that is I don't share that to say that about myself. I share that because every speaker who's ever spoken at the Purpose Summit, except for a couple extenuating circumstances, they came not just to speak, they came to attend. And they were there for all 3 days. And they poured themselves into it. They didn't fly in, give their canned talk, fly out. And what happened is that each and every single thing that they shared was unique, and they hadn't shared before because it was a combination of what they were experiencing in live time. And it was just really cool. I was surprised to see the consistency of that happen over the years because it's uncommon. It's uncommon to see that happen. And it's probably the biggest thing that I'm grateful for is that, these people who, are extremely generous with their time and their words, believe so much in the concept of purpose and the mission that we, created the summit for, to pour so much of their time and themselves into the summit.
Davin, thank you for that. I'm curious about, and I'm looking at your coachability and thinking about that. Is there a particular lesson you learned along the years? There's gazillions, but is there one that stands out for you that may have come from a specific speaker or an attendee or from your actions?
Well, it's funny that you mentioned the word coachability, because if you were to ask me what the biggest coachability lesson that I've learned is, it is to always be coachable. We've always heard the ABCs, always be closing. I can't stand that phrase. I had an opportunity to speak at an event with Desmond Howard a few years ago. And Desmond Howard shared that the biggest lesson he learned in life was to always be coachable. For those who don't know, Desmond Howard was a all-star, Heisman winning, Super Bowl winning, MVP wide receiver. But when he was at Michigan, he was a running back and he wanted to play running back. And Bo Schemblocher, his coach at the time, said, we're going to put you at wide receiver. And Desmond didn't want to play wide receiver. But Bo said, hey, if you trust me and you always remain coachable, you will go much further if you're coachable than you will if you're not. And so Desmond heard his words and agreed to play wide receiver. And because he remained coachable, he won the Heisman, went to the NFL, won the Super Bowl, won the MVP. And had he not been coachable and, was prideful and chose to stay in the running back position, that probably would not have been his legacy. And it was such a powerful talk. I'll never forget that he shared that. And, and we've heard it different ways. The day that you stop learning is the day that you stop dying. Always remember that you haven't figured it all out. Our friend Ken Blanchard, I love when he says that none of us is as smart as all of us. So there's so many different ways to say it. But I think that, we live in a world that, quite frankly, a lot of people struggle with being coached. They struggle with getting feedback, or what our friend, Gary Ridge likes to say, feed forward. So one of the things that I have always tried to do is to remain coachable, to constantly be learning and to accept feed forward when it's given, because I know that it'll make me a better version of myself to help me be a better version for those that I get to serve.
How do we share that? So how does that get shared with, and by a pretense for the things that I do, with the CEO who's been taught that they need to have all the answers? How do you transfer the knowledge of, I'm not even going to say ABC, because always be closing pops into mind, but always be coachable is great.
Yeah, well, the first thing I think we need to do is highlight that that's a bad teaching. You don't have to have it figured it all out. And I think that's the problem. I think, unfortunately, that has been for decades, that's been a problem, is that, there's been this perception that once you're a CEO, or even if you're an executive leader, that you have to have this air, this executive presence around you, this the stature that you do have it figured it all out. And I mentioned Gary Ridge earlier. I love that he constantly says that the three most powerful words that he has ever learned to say, and that he says the most often, are I don't know. Those are three powerful words. And the problem is we've got a lot of people that are afraid to say them because they're afraid that people will think less of them. And I would offer, and so would Gary probably, that I think people would think more of you if you said, I don't know, but I'll find out, or I'll find someone who does know. And I think that goes such a long way. And so I think the way that we fix that is by encouraging leaders first and foremost that you don't have to have it all figured out, and you'll earn more respect when you show your humility in sharing that you don't know. And I think that what that also does is create the space for others who then feel that when they're in the presence of an executive, that they also have to have it all figured out, that it's okay for them to not know either. And that we can encourage each other to go find the answers to the things that we don't know, rather than pretending that we do know.
It's I think the word I'm going to say is it's okay to be vulnerable, right?
Absolutely.
So by the way, Gary, I believe, got feed forward from Marshall Goldsmith, is where I first originally heard it. And I'm a big Gary Ridge fan, as well as Marshall's. So I guess that's the question. Why was I call it marketing cookie cutter? Why is one of the marketing cookie cutter lessons in life, don't be vulnerable in public if you're leading a group of people?
Well, there's this old adage about two crabs in a bucket. If you put one crab in a bucket, that crab will crawl out of the bucket and on its way to freedom. But if you put two crabs in a bucket, neither crab will ever make it out of that bucket, because once one crab starts crawling up, the other crab will pull the other crab down, and vice versa, and they never leave. So if you ever look at people who go crabbing, they always make sure that there's more than one crab in the bucket, and that's how the crabs stay in the bucket, because they're constantly pulling themselves down. And that's not something that I made up. That is fact. You can go check that out. The reason I share that story is I feel like that's been the case in life when it comes to vulnerability. What happens is we've actually created a side, and we're just now changing this, just now. We've long lived in a society that if you choose to be vulnerable, rather than celebrating that, I'm going to expose that because I don't want to be vulnerable. And if you're being vulnerable, that means that I have to be vulnerable. And I don't want to be vulnerable because you being vulnerable exposes your weakness. And that means if I have to expose my weakness, people will think less of me. And this is the society that we've lived in for years. And so what happens is, just like those crabs in the bucket, we pull each other down and we expose each other's vulnerability and weaknesses, rather than creating the space for people to be vulnerable and share their weaknesses so that we can complement those weaknesses with our strengths. And that is just now starting to change. And I don't think that we're there yet. I think that, there's been a lot of books written on vulnerability. I know Brené Brown kind of broke the ceiling on that, several years ago. But I think we're still in a place where, I remember just even a couple of years ago, there was a video on LinkedIn where there was a CEO who was crying because he had to let go of a large amount of his people, and he truly cared for those people. And he shared a very heartfelt message on LinkedIn about struggling letting go of his people. And people criticized him. They actually made fun of that video. So I don't think we've crossed the threshold yet. I think we're starting to get into the space where we can be vulnerable and not necessarily celebrate vulnerability, but at least welcome it and not marginalize it. And we've still got a long way to go in that space. But when we get to the place where we can stop pulling each other down and we can truly welcome vulnerability, so that we can not expose each other's weaknesses, but share those weaknesses so we can complement those weaknesses with each other's strengths, that's when we will have really moved the needle.
Dude, that was amazing. Thank you. You lost me for like 30 seconds in there because when you said two crabs in a bucket, I went over to YouTube to look for a video of two crabs in a bucket, and I didn't get exactly what I want. So I'll have to come back and take a look at that because I love that story. I wanted to do something for other people. And so I'm just gonna put this on here for a second. I wanted to share the 10 values of credibility. And what's really interesting is you've talked about almost all of them in who you are and what you did. And I think we got a little bit of time. What I'd love you to do is talk. I mean, you know, when you walk through each of these, the quality of being trusted, known, and liked, you've covered many of those. And what I guess what we haven't done yet, although you've done it in this conversation, is how do you go about showing respect? So being likable is simply spreading cred dust, sharing the ideas, thoughts, and actions of others. You've done that, and also showing respect. So how do you go about showing respect?
Well, I think most people would look at respect through the lens of appreciation. You know, when I think about, if you were to ask me, you know, Mitchell, what do I respect about you? I would start to talk about what I appreciate about you. I would appreciate how genuine you are. I would appreciate how authentic that you are. I would appreciate your work as a thought leader. And so I'm respecting the values of who you are as a person that have led to your accomplishments and not just your accomplishments. And I think it's important to distinguish between those two, because there's a lot of people who have accomplished a lot of great things, but quite frankly, if you were to look at their values, they're not things that we would want to celebrate. And so there are people that I wouldn't respect. Doesn't matter how much success that you've achieved. If you've led a litany of destruction in your path to achieve that success, I'm not going to respect you for what it is you achieved, because the values that you espouse to get there are not something that I would appreciate. So I think when we think about respect, it's less about what someone has accomplished. It's less about their accolades and their notoriety. And it's more about who they are as a person and their values that led them to achieve those things.
I got shivers. Thank you. Hey, listen, if you're liking this conversation and you want to learn more, either about the Purpose Summit, more importantly, Davin, and by the way, stick around. I've got one other question I want you to pay attention to. Davin, is there a best way that people should reach out to you?
I mentioned LinkedIn earlier. I love LinkedIn. I live on LinkedIn. I mean, I'm on all social platforms, but I engage in conversation on LinkedIn. So if someone's not managing that for me, that is me. So please connect. Please send a message. I'd love to start a conversation with you. And of course, you can go to davinsalvagno.com as well.
Perfect. Thank you. All right. And please reach out. So the last question, based on this conversation and where it went, is there a question that I should have asked you, or another question that you'd like to ask yourself that I haven't asked yet?
I don't know if it's a question, but maybe more of a statement. I have a dear friend, his name's Mark Ostich, and he wrote a book called If You Really Knew Me. And I love that phrase, because the whole book was about, you know, if you were to ask someone a question to really get to know them, what would you ask them? In essence, is what you're asking me, Mitchell. And his book on If You Really Knew Me was a list of all of the things that people didn't actually know about him. So I think the question that I would ask you to ask is, hey, Davin, if people really knew you, what is something that they would learn that most people don't know?
Nice.
And I would answer,
please,
that if you really knew me, you would know that I don't have it all figured out. And that I'm acutely aware of that. In fact, I wrote a song a while ago, and the lyrics said, what if I told you I didn't have it all figured out? would your love for me be replaced with doubt? I'm not here to put on a show or tell you what I already know. I just came to make a difference. And
Dude,
so
I want to listen. I want to listen to that song. If you have it, send it to me. We'll put it in the show notes.
I appreciate that. And I think, unfortunately, and this goes back to what we shared earlier, there's a lot of people today on social media that feel like they have to put on a persona that they're living their best life, that they have it all figured out. And they're telling you things that they don't even really know because they're just trying to stay in the game. And to those who've stayed through our conversation and are listening to this right now, I would encourage you that it's okay to not have it all figured out. And it's okay to share your most vulnerable, authentic self, because the more that we do that, the more that we can come alongside each other and help us figure it out together.
Once again, you've given me shivers. Thank you so much. You did absolutely amazing. I really appreciate you spending the time with us today.
Well, thank you, Mitchell. I appreciate you. Truly, truly an honor. Grateful to be here.
Oh, good. And hey, listen, I want to say this. I have not run across very many people who check off all 10 boxes of credibility. And Davin is absolutely one of them. And so if there's something you heard, something you like, something that really motivated you, that you thought was valuable enough to even go, oh my, I'd like you to share it on your own social media platform that makes sense to you. Spread some of Davin's cred dust. And thanks again for joining us today. And Davin, thank you. And everyone else, I really appreciate you. We'll see you at the next episode of Leaders Living Their Values. Take care. Bye now.